read one book per month. And for July session, we are very happy to be able to invite Professor Thompson and Mr. Robert Imam to join us for Canada-U.S. relations, history, now, and the future. And this is always our tradition to introduce the newcomers first, and then we'll have our guest speaker to have the session. And then we'll have a Q&A. At the last, we'll wrap up the session with a group photo. So today we have Kwong. Okay, yeah, Kwong, welcome. Kwong is Ottawa-based senior solution architect, designs enterprise-grade solutions that keep large organizations humming. An avid reader with a deep love of history, he's now channeling his strategic expertise into investigating in a portfolio of Main Street businesses. Thank you, Kwon. And the rest of the team, I know, and we have been together for almost 2 years. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Robert Emond to host this event. And Mr. Emond is a seasoned diplomat for over 20 years. He has been serving GAC, Government of Canada, as a senior trade commissioner for the last 20 years. And he's also has tremendous knowledge in mining and international relations. And I will give the floor to Mr. Emond.
Great, thank you. OK， 谢谢你们。今天的天气很好吧？那个那么舒服在外面，我们都在里面。所以很高兴、很荣幸给您介绍一下 Professor Van Hampson was with us today to tell us a little bit of his take on Canada-U.S. relations. So today's title is Canada-U.S. Relations, History, Now, and the Future. Professor Hampson is a leading voice in international affairs, well known in the community. He's a Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University and co-chair of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations, a forum that brings together distinguished Canadian and American leaders to navigate this vital bilateral relationship. Today's session here is in camera. So basically comments that are being said aren't to be repeated or shared. That way it'll encourage an open dialogue. Certainly don't put this on YouTube so my colleagues at GAC can see this. I'm sure some of his colleagues. So it's a discussion where we can talk openly. That's basically the bottom line. Professor Hampson is also a former president of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, which for anyone who's been in Ottawa knows is a crucible in terms of shaping how many diplomats and foreign policy thinkers go about their work here in Canada. He has published more than 30 books and 100 articles and has served in key advisory roles to the Canadian government and represented Canada in global dialogues, in conflict resolution, foreign policy, and security. So we are honored with this background that he's come this afternoon on the sunny day to share some of his views. In terms of the format, he will start with basically a presentation about 15 minutes. Then we'll go into basically a question format, a few questions for him, and then we'll go into Q&A. So it should be a nice afternoon. Professor?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I'm sorry to be ruining your Saturday on such a beautiful day. It obviously shows the commitment of the members of your book club to come out on a nice day like today, and it's not too hot. So what I thought I would do would be to talk a little bit the history of Canada-U.S. relations, to put some of the challenges that we're facing into a contemporary context, and then to offer a few opinions on how we might manage the shall we say, Trumpian seesaw that has us up in the air one moment and down on the ground at another moment. Throughout Canada's history, the specter of American annexation has never been far from the surface. Donald Trump's recent comments about making Canada the 51st state is only the latest chapter in a long tradition of American leaders and politicians imagining Canada as part of the United States. From George Washington's failed invasion of Quebec in 1775 through the War of 1812 to 19th century rhetoric about manifest destiny, the idea that Canada can or should be absorbed into the American Union has been a recurring theme. Even in the 20th century, US politicians and state legislatures periodically floated the notion. And Canadian leaders like Liberal Prime Minister Mackenzie King, who was Prime Minister of Canada both before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and shortly thereafterward, confided, and this was true in King's own diaries, that the American ultimate aim was dominance, if not outright possession of Canada. So Donald Trump's recent threats, delivered with his characteristic bravado and amplified by his imposition of sweeping tariffs, has revived Canadian anxieties, but I think it's fair to say also galvanized a new sense of national unity and national purpose. The second half of the 20th century was marked by a rather decisive shift from what might be characterized as wary coexistence with the United States to much deeper integration with the United States, driven by, obviously, geography, the removal of trade barriers, and the imperatives of continental security. In 1947, which is 2 years, I would say, after the Second World War ended, 39% of Canada's exports went to the United States and roughly 30% to the United Kingdom. But by 1950, this trend had accelerated. The share of exports to the US jumped to 65%, while the UK share fell to 15%. And that increase obviously reflected the boom in the US economy after the Second World War, the lack of available other markets to Canada. A lot of our trade before the Second World War had been with Great Britain, as we were part of what was called the Imperial Preference System. And that market increase was accelerated in 1965 by the signing of the Auto Pact, a watershed moment which linked the automotive industries of both Canada and the United States together. That was, in some ways, our first free trade agreement. And it set the stage for the Canada-US free trade agreement. Those negotiations were concluded in 1988 by Brian Mulroney. The agreement went into effect early in 1989, and that was followed shortly thereafterwards by the inclusion of Mexico in what we now used to know as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994, and its successor agreement, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement of 2020, which was negotiated during the first Trump administration. No question that those agreements were transformational. They gave a huge boost to the Canadian economy, which was in big trouble in the 1980s. We were experiencing a recession, and free trade really boosted Canada's economic fortunes. The integration of our two countries went beyond commerce. The creation of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Agreement, and systems that went into place in 1957, which established joint command for the air defense of North America. And I think that agreement obviously recognized in an era of nuclear weapons, growing bomber and ballistic missile threats to North America, that the security of Canada and the United States was inseparable. The key assumption in Ottawa was that integration would insulate Canada from the worst excesses of American protectionism, and that the sheer scale and size of the mutual benefits that came from that relationship would prevent either side from behaving rationally. But there were lots of warning signs that that was not a fair assumption in our bilateral relationship. The Nixon shocks of 1971, which included a 10% import surcharge on all of U.S. trading partners, including Canada, was quite damaging to us. We were eventually able to negotiate an exemption. And at that time, many argued that it was time for Canada to diversify its trading relationships. So that's 1971. During the prime ministership of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father. And under his government, and it was a new policy paper, it was called the Third Option, drafted by your former, shall we say, predecessors in the Department of what was then called External Affairs. That third option paper proposed three options. Maintain the status quo. That's always an option in government. Do nothing. Just let things go on their merry course. Pursue closer integration with the United States. That was option two. Or the third option, which was to diversify Canada's trade and economic relationships, strengthen the internal economy, promote national identity. And the goal there was to expand trade with Europe, with Japan, with other markets in the world. That strategy also included an important cultural dimension, such as extending Canadian content regulations and supporting the Canadian media, to foster as well institutions like the Foreign Investment Review Agency, Petro-Canada, which was a state-owned oil company at the time, in order to exercise greater Canadian control over investments coming into Canada. It was primarily directed at the United States to make sure that they didn't take over the entire Canadian economy. But in the end, it was a bit of a fizzle. Not much came of the third option, for the simple reason that economic gravity is a much powerful force on economies than wishful thinking by politicians when it comes to diversification. So our trade continued to remain overwhelmingly tied to the United States. There were periodic disputes over softwood lumber. That's a perennial. Beef exports to the United States. That's a perennial. And Canada's supply management policies in the dairy, poultry, and egg sector. After 9/11, the United States sealed the Canada-US border. It was closed for almost a week. That paralyzed supply chains. It shattered the illusion of the longest undefended border in the world. And there was a clear lesson there that in a moment of crisis, American interests will come first. And Canada, as a junior partner, was left in a very exposed position. The 2018-2020 renegotiation of NAFTA under Trump was another wake-up call, with Canada forced to make painful concessions to maintain its access to the US market. And now, with Trump back in the White House, we're now in a trade war that has escalated to unseen levels since the 1930s and the imposition of what were then called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs imposed by the US Congress on Canada in the early 1930s. The US has imposed 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian imports that are not covered by the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. 10% tariff on our energy exports. Steel and aluminum tariffs, as you know, have been doubled to 50%. And the auto sector, which was long the symbol of North American economic integration, certainly in Canada faces an existential risk as Trump pursues his goal of repatriating manufacturing to the United States. Canada initially responded with its own tariffs. Prime Minister Carney has decided not to, at least for now, retaliate to the United States, but the asymmetry in the economic relationship is stark. According to Statistics Canada, exports to the US make up roughly 17% of Canada's gross domestic product. Those are 2023 numbers, the most recently available. Those exports support roughly 2.6 million jobs. It's also fair to say that while exports are a very important part of our gross domestic product, 25% of our GDP comes from what we sell to the world. 75% of what we export goes to the United States. So there's not a whole lot of diversity there. Our second most important trading partner, as you probably know, is the European Union, followed by China and Mexico. The result of Trump's tariff wars against America's trading partners, including ourselves, has been confusion, production slowdowns, real fears, as I just mentioned, that we may lose our automobile sector, lose our steel sector. And the Bank of Canada has been repeatedly warning that these tariffs may inflict by the end of the year a recession on Canada. The OECD is projecting that Canada's growth will fall to less than 1% this year. While at the same time, the US economy doesn't seem to be taking a very big hit right now. In fact, it's booming. Prices are going up, inflation. That's a sign that consumers are spending. It's not just the tariffs that are having a knock-on effect on US prices. Our government is engaged with urgent talks to try to lower Trump's tariffs. Ottawa's offered some major concessions in those negotiations. You've probably read about it, seen it on television. We rescinded the digital services tax. We offered to participate potentially in Trump's Golden Dome missile defense initiative, which is a $175 billion space-based shield that he wants to build to intercept missiles that might threaten the North American continent. There is also, that process will begin later this year, the review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. And those talks will officially begin next year. But I think nobody's under any illusions that Trump's actions now, including his threat to impose 30% tariffs on Canadian exports, may unravel that agreement. Whatever happens in the negotiations, one thing is clear. The era of frictionless North American trade is over. It's done. And even if tariffs are reduced from 25% to what some commentators in Wall Street say will be eventually 10% tariffs that are levied against America's major trading partners, the days of zero tariffs are gone, and Canada has to prepare for a world of a tariffed world where we no longer enjoy unfettered access to the United States. But that's not all. I think there's a serious prospect that we may lose our entire auto sector sooner rather than later. And that includes not just the assembly of automobiles, but also parts. Canada is a major exporter of parts in North American automobile value chains, because parts manufacturers don't want to be subject to tariffs, and they also want to be close to the centers of assembly and final production. And that's also true, by the way, of our steel industry. We can talk about aluminum. It's a different story there during the discussion. So this brings us to the heart of the challenge that Prime Minister Carney is facing, which is to build, as he calls it, a more resilient, competitive, and diversified economy. The first step is obviously to recognize that we can no longer be over-dependent on the United States. We also have to address some serious productivity challenges in the Canadian economy, some serious investment challenges. Investment is sluggish. Our GDP per capita has been falling steadily, not just in relation to the United States, but other G7 countries. Had we not had the big boost in immigration in the final years of the Trudeau government, there would have been zero growth in the Canadian economy, a big zero. Immigration has been the driver of economic growth. It's not productivity gains or wages. And meanwhile, the public sector has been absorbing an even larger share of Canada's gross domestic product, sucking investment and labor talent out of the Canadian economy. The federal government under Trudeau over a 10-year period grew by over 100,000 public servants. And that's simply not sustainable. So what is the government going to do? Well, they've told us what they're going to do. They're going to try to strengthen internal trade, break down barriers between provinces to create one Canadian economy. That means harmonizing regulations, improving labor mobility, and making it easier for businesses to scale up in the Canadian economy and compete globally. Easier said than done. We can talk about that during the discussion. We also have to, with I would say a laser-like focus, exploit Canada's true comparative advantage. What is it? It's natural resources. We're the world's 5th largest producer of natural resources. We're uniquely positioned to supply food, fuel, fertilizer, and critical minerals to the fast-growing economies of the world. And by the way, they're not in Europe, they're in Asia. So when Mr. Carney keeps going to Europe, I kind of wonder, when are you going to go to Asia? Because that's where the real business is to be had. We also need to invest in our infrastructure, our ports, our pipelines, our railways, our communications infrastructure to get products to Tidewater and to global customers. And there, the government's new Trade Diversification Corridor Fund, support for carbon capture, clean energy, I would suggest are steps in the right direction, but it's all going to depend on execution. The best laid plans can fail unless there is continued, consistent political leadership to implement those plans. Canada also has to modernize its competition policy and regulatory environment to unlock innovation, attract private capital. That means streamlining project approvals, ensuring Indigenous participation, and have to do that certainly for major pipeline infrastructure projects, and manage the environmental and governance risks that are all essential to making mega projects, because we're talking about mega projects, big building projects, if they're going to succeed. But that's going to be a long game. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in 3 months. It's not going to happen in 6 months. We'll be lucky if we see some new infrastructure projects and shovels in the ground within a year. And let me use, since it's fashionable in this town to use hockey analogies, but I'm not going to use the elbows up hockey analogy. The lesson of the 2025 hockey face-off with the US, I think, is a good analogy. We lost the first round, but that didn't mean we went on to lose the series. We won the series and we beat the United States by adapting, focusing, learning from our lessons, keeping our heads down, and seeing things through. So we have to be in it for the series, not for the quick win. The United States is always going to be there. We're going to continue to trade with the United States. It's not like you can put a big rope on Canada and tug it out somewhere into the middle of the Pacific or the middle of the Atlantic, right? The border is 80 kilometers south of here. And for 95% of Canadians, they live within 100 kilometers, 125 kilometers of the US border. So that's not going to change. But work together as a country, which we haven't been doing very well recently. We can become stronger, more competitive, forge new partnerships abroad, reduce our dependence on the United States. And, their diversification is important because it gives you leverage in your negotiations. And we can talk about how Canada might use some of that leverage with potential trading partners to get a better deal from Donald Trump. I have some views on that, which aren't necessarily shared by officials in your department or your negotiators, but I think we can play hardball. And I know our negotiators. I know some of them. I know they're playing hardball, but it's all doable. And in some ways, and I wrote about this with Tim Sargent, former Associate Deputy Minister of International Trade. We had a provocative piece in Diplomat magazine, which has resumed publication, where we essentially argued Donald Trump has done Canada a favor. What do I mean by that? We got lazy, we got sloppy, we didn't pay attention to things that we should be doing at home to make ourselves stronger. Too easy to, you can throw a tennis ball across. You used to be able to throw a tennis ball across the Canada-US border and sell it. Well, that's not an option anymore. And so, never let a crisis go to waste. And that's the challenge that not just our government, but the provinces, Canada is facing, which is we can do it. We have one of the best educated populations in the world. It's one of the reasons why many Canadians, they get their degrees here and then they go and get a great job in the United States and become very rich. Well, they should be doing that here. And they should be investing in building this country. And I think we all owe it to our country to be doing that. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. So sober, pithy comments. You don't hear this very often, and I know sometimes hear it, but right on the money. Perhaps I'll have one or two questions, and then I'll turn it back to you with more exact questions. So maybe a macro question.
Sure.
We look back. Do you think in 15 years, when we look back on this episode and we track it, it will figure as either option A, a historical anomaly, similar to what happened in the 30s,
right.
What happened in the 19th century. We'll look at this saying this was an anomaly. The new coming administration after Trump reversed, some of the momentum that was heading in a different direction. Canada came out okay. It's still a little bit sloppy and weak and lazy, but it's doing all right. Or option B, a little bit of option A, but we followed up on some of the well-pointed advice or views that you had in terms of a hard lesson, hard medicine from an antagonist like Trump, which made us up our game, get rid of excess spending, reduce government, increase infrastructure, communications, ports, etc., exactly on the lines you're saying, resulting in a much stronger country. Those are kind of like the two.
Well, I think you've put your finger on it there. Certainly going into this crisis, I think the hope was, well, we'll be able to cut a deal. And it'll be going back to the status quo ante. I think it's fair to say that the government, our Prime Minister, recognize we're not going back to the future. We're not going back. And there's a reason for that. Trump and the people around him, even if he were to drop dead tomorrow, are committed to reshoring American manufacturing in the United States, using tariffs as a way to bring down not just the fiscal deficit, but a massive forgotten what the latest number is, $34 trillion debt that is unsustainable. And tariffs, if you've been following the news, they're actually generating revenues for the federal treasury of the United States. In 2024, excise taxes generated something like $89 billion. Today, figures for the end of May show that for the federal treasury, and a lot of Trump's tariffs haven't actually gone into effect, but certainly some of them have. It's already generated over 110 billion in revenue. 20%. And so it's a massive increase, and the year's not over. Why does that matter? The United States, if they were prudent, would do what every country in the world, including our own, has done, which is to put in place a value-added tax, which is essentially a consumption tax, right? That's what the GST, HST is in Canada. We did it under the Mulroney government in the early 90s. He introduced the GST because we had a big fiscal problem in this country, and we sort of followed the European example there. That will never happen in the United States. They will never have a value-added tax. Why? So, political. The federal government cannot impose a sales tax. It's a non-starter. Even though, economists and others have said, this is the way you have to go. They can't do a but.
Lose their government.
Yeah. So the second best solution is a tariff. Why? Because that tariff is being applied to a lot of finished goods that entered the United States from China, from Europe. They're taking the big hit there, and you're seeing consumer consumption going down. And after a lot of companies were anticipating the tariffs, so they got everything into the trade pipeline. But trade is now going down. So it's working. It's definitely working. And the American economy, we're now beginning to see some, creeping price inflation. But, and I suspect it will, settle somewhere around 10 or 15%. And there'll be specific sectoral tariffs that may be a lot higher in some sectors and lower in others. No question about that. But if you want to, sort of really understand the thinking behind it, don't pay attention to Donald Trump's social media postings. There is a paper that was written, it's a fairly technical paper, but it's quite readable, published by the Hudson Bay Institute, no relation to the Hudson Bay Company, by Stephen Mirren, who is chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And he is a serious economist. He's one of the few really serious people in the inner circle of the White House. He wrote this paper kind of laying out the whole strategy, mapping it, and why this was the way to kind of deal with a series of structural problems in the US economy, having to do with its chronic fiscal deficits, its debt, an overvalued currency. US dollar is now coming down, right? So the strategy, notwithstanding all the turmoil and chaos that we see in the Oval Office, it is actually beginning to bite and hold. The other piece of it, which was supposed to be the budget bill, came out in typical fashion, not really doing what it should have done. But it is lowering corporate taxes. That's the other piece of the puzzle, to lower corporate taxes and to cut government spending, right? They got to cut their spending. When you're running $1 trillion deficits, you can't be underwriting the defense security of the Western world. And as Chancellor Merz of Germany said yesterday or the day before yesterday in the BBC interview, Europe's been a free rider. He admitted it. Of course they have. They should be paying for their own defense. And they're now buying the Patriot missiles that are going to Ukraine. Well, they should have been doing it a long time ago. Right? So, there may be some good that comes out of this.
Sure. One last follow-up question, and then I'll throw it to the floor. In terms of Canada's next steps, so Canada, similar to Europe, has been to a certain extent relying on U.S. Security for its needs, and you've seen that in the 90s in terms of the Liberal government not proceeding with various naval purchases, helicopters, other things, and now you're seeing a certain change of tack in terms of Carney now saying that 2%, not 5%, billions of dollars more. As reported in the newspaper, I think D&D has no expectations of cuts, perhaps 2%, whereas other departments are at 15%. Again, Carney has said that the expenditures on major national scope projects will go up. Infrastructure, again, billions and millions of dollars of spending. Again, what you said, a 1%, a projected increase for GDP, which would be zero without, or 1%. If immigration falls, it seems that the course could be lower, given it would be at 0% without immigration that occurred in the last 5 years. So if you add up all of that together, which is a huge funding envelope, plus the tariffs, you end up with a situation where Canada has, and the timelines involved, you're saying 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, you've got certainly quite a very steep climb to do before you're actually able to monetize this change. How does that? How do you see that play out with your historic perspective? How do you see it play out? You already had murmurings of independence coming out of Alberta. You've got certainly unhappiness, which is being expressed by Indigenous groups. You've got a minority government which could fall very easily. They've got a 2-seat lead. From your how does this play out? Again, from your historical perspective.
Well, things could very quickly fall apart. You're absolutely right that Prime Minister Carney is in a minority government situation, which means his hands are tied. His political capital is already beginning to, shall we say, dissipate, because voters have high expectation. If we see an uptick in inflation, that will hurt him, no question about it. When it comes to unemployment, if somebody loses their job in a steel plant, unless you're actually working in the steel plant, it's not your problem, right? But if you start paying more in groceries and for the ordinary necessities of life, that becomes a huge political problem. And it's what brought Donald Trump to power. One of the things that brought him was high inflation in the United States. And I would have, if we were to sort of replay the recent federal election again over, had not Donald Trump sort of, made his existential comments about Canada, we probably would have been looking at a conservative government in this country. Why? Because inflation was affecting ordinary Canadians right across the board. So that is a challenge. Western alienation is it's a challenge. I don't think it's an existential threat because all the public opinion polls show that the overwhelming majority of Albertans are generally sensible people and know that it's better to be part of Canada if you're dealing with Donald Trump. I mean, some might want to become part of the United States. I certainly have some friends in Alberta who would happily become part of the United States, but I would say to them, be careful what you wish for. That's also true in the case of Quebec, which delivered the Liberals to power. They very quickly realized that, and again, if you look at opinion polls, Quebecers don't want to be independent. They don't want to be dealing with the United States on their own, right? Much better to be part of Canada. So I think that's somewhat less. I think there's a stronger sense of national unity. But here's the challenge. We're going to have to work harder, a lot harder, and we're going to be poor at the same time, at least in the short term. That's the reality, right? And governments are going to have to cut back on their services. It's going to affect everything from healthcare to universities, you name it. It's going to get ugly. And there are going to be a lot of very unhappy people who've lost their jobs. And it's not clear to me that the government is going to be able to simply keep the printing presses rolling to issue checks. So we're in for a rough time if this, tariff war world continues. And we're not going to get a lot of sympathy. I don't think we're going to get a lot of help from the Europeans, to be honest. So, we're going to have to kind of pull together as a country and get serious about exploiting our comparative advantage, which is to sell our energy, our food, our resources to Asia. Mm-hmm. Europe, forget it. Mm-hmm. This is where I get controversial. Europe is an aging society, right? They're getting old. The idea that they can meet that 5% defense target in 10 years is a joke, right? And you're already seeing, Spain, the Prime Minister of Spain is the only honest politician in Europe right now. He said, we can't do it, and we're not going to sign on to this, right? The Germans are talking a good line, but they have some serious structural problems in their economy. For Canada, where's the fastest growing middle class in the world? It's in Asia. Right? Who wants our commodities? Asia. China continues to build coal-fired power plants to meet its booming energy needs. What we should be doing is selling natural gas to China, of which we have lots, LNG, and helping China convert, because you can do it. We've done it in North America. You can convert your coal-fired plants into natural gas power plants. And you can also bleed a bit of hydrogen into them, not too much, because you might blow up your compressors. But you can bleed a bit of hydrogen in to bring the carbon footprint down to a third of what it is for a coal-fired plant. And if we did that for China, for India, we would not have a climate change problem. It would reduce the emissions by roughly a quarter. Right? So there, for those in the environmental movement, and I don't mean to offend anybody here, but they say, oh no, we mustn't be selling natural gas or oil. The big problem is coal. And we have to wean the world off coal. And that's doable.
Is it technically? I'm
Technically, of course.
Distance, I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can, as I said, coal-fired generators of electric power, which in China is, you can drive your coal-fired Tesla or your, what is it, YBD?
BYD.
BYD.
BYD. BYD. Anybody know what BYD stands for?
Now it's a build your dream.
Build your
Yeah,
dream.
they say,
exactly.
but it's they just
Exactly.
created
I know,
based
I
on the
know,
Chinese.
yeah.
Yeah.
I actually knew that because I thought, why did they get BYD? But if it's powered by a coal-fired electricity plant, that it's self-defeating, right? So there are definite opportunities there. We don't need to sign trade agreements with China or other countries to sell our commodities. We just need agreement to sell, right? But there are definite opportunities there. And to be honest, it's much easier because we've already done it to build a pipeline from Alberta or the Northern Territories into British Columbia. There's a slight problem with the Premier of British Columbia, but he's coming around. I think much harder to build it across the country to Quebec, but we've done it before, right? When Canada built the Trans-Canada Pipeline in 1956, do you know how long it took from the approval?
Isn't that 20?
18 months.
Wow.
In
That's
50s.
That's
The 50s.
amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, we did it, right? We ramped up defense spending in the Second World War, and we were after the United States, the biggest supplier of munitions to Europe, right? So, we can do it, but, that means, and, Carney understands it. I mean, he's introduced and got the fast approval of Bill C-5. That's not going to solve the problem, by the way. I chair something called or co-chair something called the Expert Group on Canada-U.S. Relations with the Honorable Parent Beatty. And we did a paper that will be coming out on Monday on Canada's energy future. And one of the things we did was we did it's called a retrospective analysis, where we looked at 3 major projects that have been completed: Coastal Pipeline, the first stage of the Kitimat LNG, and then Trans Mountain Pipeline. And we sort of did a directional analysis imposing Bill C-5, would it have made a difference? And these projects took, on average 12 to 15 years. What would have been the impact of Bill C-5 if we'd had it in place then? It would have reduced the timeline by about 1.5 years. And why is that? Court challenges, protests, provincial environmental approvals, right? Because they're an important part of this, right? They got to do it too, right? So far they haven't, except Alberta. And construction delays, worker problems, those kinds of things. So there are a lot of pieces, and to come back to something you said earlier, that have to kind of, with these mega projects, there are a lot of pieces that got to fit together, and it's not just the piping. So, that's going to take extraordinary leadership, cooperation, and a sense of let's just do it and get it done.